Well, I've got just a little bit after 7, and we'll go ahead and get started here this evening. I want to say welcome to the second in our series of virtual ag meetings that we're hosting here in the Frontier Extension District. For those that may have been on for our first one, this might be a little repetitive, but in terms of why we're doing it, but the whole COVID-19 situation has got us in a completely different meeting format, and the Frontier District always holds quite a few educational meetings each winter and spring, and we wanted to continue that. So we put together this 6-part series of meetings with, we hope, a lot of variety that you can find of interest and take home and use. And I want to introduce my co-workers right quick. We work together as a team to put this together. We've got Ryan Schaub in our Garnett office. We've got Rod Schaub from our Linden office. And then my office professional here in Ottawa and in charge of communications in our district, Madison Maurer. I'm glad to have her a part of our team too. And you had received all your email correspondence and everything through Madison. I'm Darren Hibden, and I'm stationed here in the Ottawa office, and we're glad to have you on. Those of you that are on Zoom, those of you that are on Facebook Live, glad to have you. Be sure and use the chat option if you've got questions for our speakers this evening. We've added in a little extra from what we had mentioned here on our flyer. Our flyer talked about going to have one on cool season grass management and then wildlife plots. But also we've got a little section on soil testing. Soil testing is something that plays into both of these very, very well. So we're glad to have Dr. Bruno Perduria with us. You won't believe it, but he's coming to us from Brazil. He's been hired to be our Southeast area extension agronomist. And they've had him hired for over a year, and well, COVID has played quite the trick and not allowed Bruno to make his way to Parsons yet, but he's been very active with the agents throughout the southeast part of Kansas, and we're glad to have him here this evening. He's going to share with us some do's and don'ts for soil testing. Bruno, it's all yours.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, and Stu, to having me here today. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you guys in this evening. I will try to be very quickly today. I'm sharing these with Stu, and I want to make a mess. I don't want to make a mess. So, as you said, the idea today is to talk a little bit about soil sampling, what we believe that is very important thing to get really good numbers. Because we can always get a number, but getting a good number takes focus. So I want to share with you some thoughts on that today, because we really need, good numbers to have a good fertilizer recommendation. So when we think about components of soil test, we have at least 4 steps. I like to say that we have the field sampling, and then we have the second step, which is the chemical analysis, when we send the samples to the lab. And then we need to read and interpret the results, and also to make the fertilizer recommendation. So we always looking for these as a 4-step process. And most of us are always interested and concerned about how we're going to analyze the samples. And I would say that the first step is the most important for us. We need to have a really good field sampling to get a good number. And that is the point today. So when you get in a field, you need to have in mind what you have there. What kind of variabilities you see in a field? What kind of topography you have? Do you have aerial photos? Can you have an idea about soils or yield maps? Do you have anything in of those? Because when we have this idea, we can better understand the field, and so we can make better decisions. So if you have a topography, a difference in topography, you can split the field in 3, for example, and you can sample the bottom, the side slope, and the hilltop. So those are what we call direct indicators of variability. Indicators that show us that we need to take an action in terms to have a good soil sample. But we also have what we call indirect indicators of variability. So do you know if in the field, do you have an old homestead or a feedlot? Or for example, do you have any access to the history of this field in terms of what did they plant in the past? What kind of fertilizer did they use? Or they dropped some manure out there? So if you know things like that, you could, for example, again, split this kind of field into separate areas and sample it as a field A or field B. It will give you better numbers than you have only one field if you know that there is a history, of differences. More than that, we need to consider the time of the year that you are collecting the soil samples and the depth. In terms of time of the year, if we have, for example, crop residues on the ground, this is a graph with corn remaining in the field. It depends on the time of the year that you collect. You have such nutrient leaching from the crop residue going to the soil. So if you have rainy or if you have good environment that will allow those nutrients to go to the soil, you will have different nutrient numbers. You have different numbers in your soil test. So if possible, sample at the same time of the year to reduce the variability. And also the depth. If you collect a sample 0 to 6, or what we recommended right now, you have a number. If you collect 0 to 4, probably you're gonna have a higher number because in the upper layer of the soil, we're gonna have higher concentration of the nutrients. And then the last but not the least, the number of soil cores. We know that the more soil cores you take, we are basically more accurate with the numbers. If you were looking for soil test P, for example, where we have in this graph, we should have something like 15 to 20 cores to get lower variability in this sample. So we know sometimes it's too many cores and it is no longer practical, but we need to find a way to collect as much samples as you can and keep this number in mind, at least 15 and between something like 15 and 20 samples will be good to take a composite sample from a field. So I want to just share with you, it was a kind of different soil sampling methods that Dr. Sassenrath and Darren, they did it last year. And I want to share with you Dr. Sassenrath and data set. She collected a few samples with different methods. So the first one was in a ditch near to the field, close to the field gate, in only one location within the field, and 0 to 3 and 0 to 6 inch, and also using a sharpshooter as correct as possible. And the last one was the correct way to do it, with a probe, 2-inch samples, at least 6 cores, and using 0 to 6 inch depth. And you can see the graph here. We have the last one here, the correct one. So to potassium, we have around 100 ppms, and to phosphorus 51. But when you look at the variation, you can see that the numbers ranging from 79 to 268, and from 27, 28 to 75. So it's a lot of variation there with what, this is how not to take samples. We need to understand that when we don't do things in the right way, we're gonna have a number that we cannot rely on to get, a good fertilizer recommendation. So if you looking for a correct sample, we need to have in mind 0 to 6 surface sample for pH, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and organic matter. 0 to 3 surface sample in no-till for pH and lime. 0 to 24 inch profile sample for nitrite and sulfur and chloride. So take multiple cores for each composite samples. Try to avoid contamination with dirty buckets, galvanized buckets. Never oven dry soil samples, and try to keep, especially if you have nitrate N samples, you need to air dry it if you want to be shipped in a few days. So if you take all of these, you're gonna have a good number, and so you will be able to manage well the nutrients in your field. So that was what I have for you guys today. If you have questions or comments, I can take it just after Stu wrap up his presentation. Thank you.
All right. Hey, Bruno, thank you. And we look forward to getting you here to Kansas and getting you on board full time. And hopefully that can come sooner than later. But if somebody has a question for Bruno, be sure and type it into the chat, and we will get into that here later after our next presentation. We'll now move on to Dr. Stu Duncan, and he's an agronomist for the northeast area of Kansas, housed out of Manhattan. And Stu does a wide variety of crop and forage work throughout northeast Kansas. Brome grass is a major crop in the area that he serves, and he's going to share with us tonight information on cool season grass, whether you have brome or whether you have fescue. They're very, very similar in their growth patterns and types and fertility, and he'll be covering that here when we get him pulled up here on the screen. So it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Guys, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. It almost feels like home. Well, actually, you're about 25 miles from where I grew up, over near Olivet, Kansas. I wish this was face to face, but we're going to make do. There are some advantages to this. One of them is you don't have to look at me, and so that's part of the deal. I think Bruno did a great job. I really was looking forward to him presenting this evening so that we could set the table, because Darren wanted me to talk about cool season grass management, but mostly with an emphasis on brome grass, and that is just fine with me. I've been working, that's what we had at Osage County. Excuse me. Got to shut my door over here. That's another thing I forgot to take care of before I sit down here. But brome grass is a really important grass. There is a bit of fescue in your area, but generally it gets a little further south. But I've been back up in northeast Kansas. I actually started my career, and I told some folks today, if it hadn't been for weather like this, I might not have ever met my wife of 40 years. So interviews got snowed out 3 times, and I wound up getting a job up at Holton. And anyway, it's a long story. We'll do it some other time. But brome has always been just something to me that has been it's fun to work with. And you get good fertilizer responses, and fertility is such a key thing that we have going with our brome grass and with fescue. You guys have had Gary Kilgore for years, and then Doug Shoup, and Doug and I, we did some stuff together. So you may have seen some of these slides with a different background before, but we have over 1 million acres of brome in Kansas, and it primarily is from about Highway 15, the west side of the Flint Hills, over to the Missouri line, and generally above Highway 50. But it does creep around. Some of the best stands I've seen were out in Pratt, Kansas, and I know they irrigate some. Sam Hands, a guy that went to school about the same time I did out at Garden, they had quite a setup. But smooth brome, they're both, and fescue, tall fescue are both well adapted. High production, good quality, decent quality. There was some management considerations, and it also gives you a chance to expand that grazing season off the warm season natives that we have here in Kansas. You know, one thing we need to remember with brome is it's a lot like growing wheat. Now, I spent 14 years out at Hutchinson, so I got to play with wheat quite a bit too. Each year's crop is produced by forage or by tillers that develop in the fall. And so year to year, this is going to replace them. And you're going to need a new tiller. It's going to need a good root system, and will facilitate that, have those healthy tillers. And a fall fertilization, and especially with the phosphate, is going to help with that development. But you got to be able to have a factory to build that carbohydrate reserve too, and that's why the nitrogen is important. In years past, back in the late 70s and early 80s, the farmers up in Jackson County, and you saw that was still the highest producing county in the state. Most of them paid for their fertilizer bill with a seed crop that they cut off, and had enough left over to pay for the augers that they stripped when they were trying to dump it. So they got the seed a little bit wet and were dumping it out of the combine. But you know, a little bit of we would fertilize in the fall. We always got a better seed crop. We had a little more forage. Wasn't quite as good a forage. We had a little more old stuff in it, but that was the way it went. Now we're almost all up in the northeast part of the state, almost all fall fertilization, or excuse me, an early spring fertilization. But we want to get those healthy parent tillers to increase that bud survival and keep our yields high and pay back our fertilizer bill. Any time of stress we put on brome, and especially over time, and fescue the same, we can kill existing tillers and rhizomes and thin out our stands. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. You know, with brome, you know, when should you hay it? And you hopefully by Memorial Day. That was always my time that I thought I had about the maximum dry matter and quality, or those lines crossed. There's a good old publication from K-State, needs revised, but it's still a good one. And I stole that picture from Bob Kallenbach over at Missouri because I didn't have one. But that's, you know, we talk about smoke blowing on the brome. That's when it happens. It's about Memorial Day. Did a study a few years back where we did cut from very early head, late boot early head. Had good quality, but we did not get the maximum we want. How low should we cut it? Well, the lowest we really ought to cut it's 4 inches. I'd like to see another inch on there, but with that's one thing I've had against the disc mowers. You can take it a lot lower than that, and sometimes we've done that. Brome can still have a pretty good ability to recover if we will fertilize it properly. We can even do it in the fall too, with a light grazing or haying, if you leave the stubble for over winter. Response to Ann, this is kind of a real general slide. This was stuff we did up in Northeast Kansas. There were 35 different strips over those 4 years where we had tests. And you can see brome for, you know, depending on what our weather's going to be, we saw just a pretty linear response to our nitrogen addition. And if you've got a soil test of over soil test phosphate of 20, and actually it's probably 15 or better, you know, I would just, you know, you're looking at a straight in supply, but you're still going to, you need to replenish that phosphate. And we have neglected that over the years, and we have some bad effects of that. Maximum profits on a study that Shannon Blocker, who used to be down in Anderson County, when she came back and did her master's, said would have said that we have our maximum profits at 120 pounds of N. I don't like swathing brome from one end of the field and then deadhead it back because it'll lay over, and you guys know that. And fescue will do a bit of that the same way. If we over fertilize, yeah, we get a better tonnage. but you can't get it all harvested and you really got a mess. Now, we actually plan on, if you've got a decent phosphate rating, you're probably gonna, researchers soon, we'll get about 30 pounds of dry matter for every pound of nitrogen that we add to that crop in fertilizer. So if we should get about 900 extra pounds when we put on 30 pounds of fertilizer, 1,800, close to a ton if we go on up. And you see it kind of tracks along that way too. Weather dependent there as well. With fescue, what this number right here means, that one and this one, the one before the X, that's almost 25 pounds of forage for every pound of nitrogen that's added to that fescue. This is from up near Ames. The Kallenbach at Missouri, and I look at his stuff too, but he found about 25 pounds. So it was pretty steady with what we saw, they saw up in Iowa State. But he also said, once you approach 100 pounds, that curve starts bending just like it did for brome. Well, one thing with the fescue in Missouri, his recommendations have been that you start fertilizing for fall applied nitrogen in right at the 1st of August, and said that his responses dropped pretty incrementally after September 1st. I'm not as used to fertilizing the fescue as those guys are. It's a little choppy on this graph. Down here is what our soil test parts per million were for those graphs. And Darren's got a copy of this, and I'll leave this with him too, or you can go back and watch it. But even with Dickinson County 1994, the solid green line had a that's really a medium phosphate level for brome grass, but you can see adding 40 pounds kicked us up a little bit, but it was still that once we got up to 80 pounds, we didn't get a response from the phosphate. Butler County, this dark line actually showed every time we had phosphate after we got up to 80 pounds, we may have we didn't help our yields for sure. But that was a very high tested soil and very productive. That took a long time to harvest that plot by hand. But and again, the maximum profit for those studies was that we would, and this is from 58 different studies since 1980, and we've had more than that since then from when I took this, but 25 pounds of phos is about where the maximum profits would occur. Here, they didn't help a bit in this set of slides. And again, in Northeast Kansas, over 13 soil tests, this was the phosphate at about 13. When the phosphate's low, you will see a little bit more response from your nitrogen. If it's less than that 15 pounds per million phosphate in the soil, if you add that, then we were using 30, but when I added 30 to our nitrogen increments, we actually pulled, instead of about 30 pounds of forage for every pound of nitrogen with that phos in there, we really generally got 35 to 40 pounds of forage back for that combination of, say, 60 pounds of nitrogen plus 30 pounds of phos in there with it. It just really enhanced what we were doing. If you got a low P test, and the only way you're going to have a low P test or know you've got a low P test is if you take a soil test correctly, just like Bruno said. Something I have been seeing more of, Darren and Ryan, and it really concerns me, is we're seeing more of this brighter yellow, not nitrogen deficiency. I don't know if you guys have seen much of this in Southeast Kansas, but I'm seeing sulfur deficiency start to show up. I don't like testing for, I would recommend testing for sulfur, but that's because I'm not the one taking those 2-foot deep samples or pulling them out of the ground. And we can't do that on many of our soils that are in fescue and in brome grass, because a lot of them were terraced, so they were farmed at one time, but it's kind of thin ground as a general rule. You'll normally find it on coarse textured soils, sandy types, low organic matter. They're talking 1.5% or lower. When it's cold and wet, soil sulfur is released from organic matter, just like when we, we put on anhydrous in the fall. It hangs up in the soil. It does not convert till those bugs start working. That will cause it to release, or we decompose our organic matter, and we will get our release of sulfur and nitrogen for the organic matter. But soil's got to be well aerated. We don't want them saturated, and we don't want them below 50 degrees. One of the big reasons I'm seeing this now is because we have scrubbed the sulfur out of our atmosphere. And, the Clean Air Act has caused me to have sulfur deficiencies, but that's how it goes. If you've been using manure, you're probably never going to see this. And the same way with a lot of your micronutrients or other fertilizers. Used to be our source of sulfur wasn't just atmospheric. We got it with the ammonium nitrate that we used. It was a byproduct in those fertilizers. But sulfur is a good source. You can use ammonium thiosol or ammonium sulfate. Gypsum is a really good source and fairly inexpensive if you can find a source of it now. I know they're still hauling it from the power plant up here at Jeffrey, but you get very far and the trucking will take you down. They're only $35 a ton, which is about 9 cents a pound for sulfur. And like I said, I don't ever see a reason to put more than 20 out there, but if you're getting a load of gypsum, you might want to think a little bit more than that. So, 200 pounds or so. Now, as we're managing our pastures, the weed management gets into that too, and our fertility program can play a really big deal. Weed appearance many times, it just indicates that the brome or the fescue isn't as competitive. Maybe he has drought recovery, or you're not been, a lot of folks dropped their phosphate fertilizer when the fertilizer prices really went up several years back. They haven't ever got down to as inexpensive as they were prior, but they are lower. But can you afford not to run as many cattle or get as much hay off of it? I generally don't tell, if guys want to spray their pastures, I don't, I'm not a real big fan of that unless there is heavy pressure. And the highly invasive weeds are really problematic and need to be controlled. One we've been seeing a lot of, you might recognize this little foxtail here. Sarah Lancaster and I, we just started a foxtail control in brome grass last year and found out several things that should be in the report of progress next spring. Had some interesting findings. One of them was that I won't ever use Escort on smooth brome again. I know Darren told me that you use that to suppress heading and fescue sometimes down there. I believe that was grass he was talking about. And it's probably harder on fescue than it is on brome. And you can see we had a nice little seed bank in there. Know what your weeds are you're trying to control. Again, the best herbicide is dark. So if you've got a good thick brome stand, you may see some weeds, and especially after you cut or if you've grazed it hard and we get rainfall all summer, that's when we start seeing things happen. Or we get a really hard freeze as that brome has really started growing in the spring. Gee, sounds like last spring, doesn't it? We did it in 2007 and we've done it again. There was another year in between. I think it was 13 or 14, we froze it hard. And brome was pretty far along. It really weakened those stands up. They started to fill back in, but now it's filling in with foxtail. Is it an annual or a biennial or a perennial that you're dealing with? The annuals and the biennials, we had a lot of asters last summer. Is that a big deal? Not really. Musk thistles and winter annuals, yes, those are a big deal. But you catch them when they're small. They're a lot easier to control, and you just keep an eye on them. The perennials, things like, Sericea lespedeza, which is noxious, or hemp dogbane, which is obnoxious, they need some growth on them, 10 to 20 inches. And you need to get something that's going to translate to well to the roots. And again, 2,4-D or Escort generally work well on the annuals and the biennials. But you got to get something like a hemp dogbane, something that's got some fluroxypyr in it. The old starring that's the active ingredient in it. Again, I said I wasn't going to put Escort on my brome again. It was just pretty tough when we did it. Generally, they've got those two, brome and fescue, have pretty good tolerance to herbicides, but usually the brome injury is going to run from the phenoxys, like, well, 2,4-D is not going to be as bad as Tordon, but then there you got another growth regulator, Banvel or dicamba. That can cause some brome injury to it. So it can be touchy, and especially like last spring after it freezes, or if it freezes hard and it doesn't warm up so that brome can metabolize that herbicide out, you can get some ugly stuff like that. That was a beautiful brome stand, a little bit of some other broadleaves, but I don't know if my cooperator is going to let me go on his farm again. They have 3 strips that look just like that, and we did it in 2 different places, in Dickinson County and Pot County, and that just really hammered that brome. And we didn't get very good foxtail control. That was an ounce of Escort was what caused that. There's another herbicide out there, and Darren, I'm cranking as fast as I can here. I know I've just gone over my limit. Broom sedge blue stem, and I think that's something that I've seen more and more of. It's actually is a blue stem, really, cousin to the big blue stem anyway. It's an andropogon. It's a native. It's a warm season, short-lived perennial. It only has about a 3-year lifespan, and poverty grass or sage grass or a couple of the other names that'll go by. It can produce some allelopathic chemical, and it's not just in natives. I've seen a lot of it in brome grass. First off, I thought it was back up there, I see a little bit. It looked a lot like small or little blue stem in the fall, but it didn't, and it wasn't. It was a bunch grass though, and if you're trying to interseed some legumes into your brome or fescue stand, it can be a pain in the neck. First off, it'll produce allelopathic chemicals, and it can be a challenge for clover because it's going to do some nitrogen fixing of its own. It's got a very shallow root system, and the stems, like I say, the color is about the same as switchgrass. The heads, obviously, seed head is not the same, and it's only about 2 to 4 foot tall at the max. Usually it's not quite even, it's about 3 foot is what I see, but it looks like a little blue stem head almost. It's more of an orange to bronze color though, whereas the little blue is more of a purplish red, and this one's more like the switch. But you know what it looks like, or you know what it looks like in your neighbor's field anyway. But one of the big thing is it's usually you're not gonna see much of it unless you have lower fertility, or overgrazed, or hayed too late, that type of thing. It has low requirements for phosphate in the soil. That our native grasses developed under those situations, and it's just like it's a native. Don't like it, but that's how it developed in those as well. It also tolerates low pH soils. Do we ever see that in southeast or in eastern Kansas? Quite often, unfortunately. Excuse me. Even though it's unpalatable and pretty low quality, cattle will eat it when it's young and tender. Well, they do the same thing with slough grass, and when it's young and tender, it's not too bad. But anybody that's driven through a slough in eastern Kansas with their arm hanging out the window and no long sleeve shirt on through the bottom of those, you know what it's like. At least the broom sedge doesn't cut you like that. But as the quality of the broom sedge gets lower when it's fertilized and intensively grazed, I don't know who would want to do that. Mullen's not been very effective for controlling it. The burning in the late summer can reduce broom sedge stands. It's a bunch grass, and that crown will heat up and smolder because it's got a lot of trash in there. Only problem is you can also reduce your smooth brome and fescue stands. So, and the fall burn is also going to favor cool season weeds. It's going to leave it bare out there for a while. Glyphosate's pretty effective on it. It's also pretty effective on brome and fescue. So fertility is your best option. These guys over at Southwest, the research center at Mount Vernon, Missouri, Blevins and that group, a 3-year study. When they didn't have any lime or phosphate that they added, there was their fescue stand, there's their broom sedge. They put about 2x the rate out there, and 50 pounds of phos, and you can see broom sedge started going down and the fescue certainly jumped up. Now this, if you're going to do it, you're going to need to lime to get rid of this. If it's your pH is below 5.8, a third to half of the lime rate, or even 2,000 pounds of ECC on top of the soil, even though it's not going to work in very far, will have an effect down to 2 to 3 inches. It's just going to take time to get there. Put at least 30 pounds of phosphate on in the fall if that soil test P is low. Keep an eye on your potash too. I'm seeing more problems with that. Now, broom sedge reduced in fescue, but the results are incremental and they'll take several years. I just had another slide from these guys. This was on a study where they weren't really looking for broom sedge reduction, but they got it with the cattle, and I think they were looking at something else. But these fields both had a soil test phosphate of 3 parts per million. They put 100 pounds of phos on, actual phos, 3 years in a row, and raised that soil phos up to 30 parts per million. So you're not going to see a response much after that. And they also didn't do anything else other than that, except their nitrogen fertilizer, and they cleaned that increase in fertility. Fescue came back and choked it out. But again, your whole fertility program just is built around good soil tests, liming if you need to, even as a top dress, to get that surface pH up. It makes a world of difference. With fescue, 30-30-10 late summer, that August through September will help with the fescue. And brome, it's going to be a little bit later on brome grass if you wanted to put some out in the fall, if you were going to graze, if you weren't, just to get some competition there. It's undesirable. The broom sedge takes advantage of low fertility sites and either overutilized or a little bit overmanaged meadows and pastures. And again, the competitiveness of the brome and the fescue is what's going to control it or reduce it. It's just going to take several years to do it.
All right. Well, Stu, thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Let's see, I got to quit sharing, right?
If anybody has questions, get a hold of either Rod, Ryan, or myself at either our Garnett, Linden, or Ottawa offices, and we can get your question forwarded on to either Dr. Bruno or Dr. Stu, and again answer back to you. But soil testing, a very, very important part of the base of getting started for a forage program, or we'll find out here with wildlife food plots. And of course, soil testing can be done through each of our individual offices. So be sure and give us a holler if soil testing is something that you'd like to take part in.